World Bank is an important stakeholder of Pakistan since 1950s. Bank helped Pakistan with major infrastructure projects. Mangla and Tarbela dams are good examples. Indus Water Treaty was not possible without Bank's help. Bank is now more focused on human development. It recently brought out its report Pakistan at 100. Managing editor GVS Najma Minhas sat down with World Bank country director in Pakistan to understand Bank's vision.
The World Bank has recently launched its Pakistan at 100 report. So I wanted to know, what was your inspiration behind putting up this project?
Thanks, Najma, for this opportunity. So, a couple of years back, when Pakistan was completing its last IMF program, we looked at the economic history of the country. And our initial findings suggested that, Pakistan had two distinct phases of economic growth. The first 40 years, you saw Pakistan doing well vis-a-vis its peer countries, and the next 30 years, it just started kind of not doing as well as it should have been. It was not very successful. And then we kind of looked at what kind of a country then Pakistan will be in 2047, if the last 30 years is going to be the trajectory they're going to continue. And it had some, for us, initially challenging findings. And then we looked at how Pakistan can then position itself in this region, given that you are surrounded by some fast-growing economies, and whether Pakistan would be sort of part of that growth momentum, or whether it will fall behind and will not be the kind of what I would call a successful economy when it turns 100. We had also done similar analysis for China and Vietnam. In 2010 in China, we did China 2030, and in 2015 we did Vietnam 2035. So in a way, it gave us the sort of, I would say, the prior experience and expertise having done these kind of long-term simulation. So that's what inspired us to sort of do Pakistan.
What were your key findings in that report that you've put together?
So, based on our analysis, by the way, that involved over 100 researchers drawn from the World Bank and outside in Pakistan as well as globally. So there are two possible scenarios for Pakistan's future in 2047. One, a very aspirational one, where it can become an upper middle income country before 2047.
Right.
To put some numbers, it will be like a $2 trillion economy and a population of under 300 million. The second scenario is business as usual. You continue how you continued in the last 30 years. But you have the boom and bust that keeps recurring every 5 years or so.
Yep.
And you'll end up sort of as where you are today, with a population of 400 million.
Right.
And welfare gains not having actually benefited. And that will be really tragic, given the fact that you have a young population, which is 2/3 of the country today. So what do they grow up into? So, and then median incomes would even fall.
What are some of the key reforms that we need to implement to reach this 2 trillion economy that you mentioned?
So first is investing in human capital, which is something that Pakistan needs to do a lot more than what it is doing.
Right.
And you can see that from the human capital outcomes.
Yep.
And given its youthful population, how do you turn youth bulge into a demographic dividend? Second would be the whole investment by private sector.
Okay.
Historically, Pakistan has had a low savings rate.
Right.
And that could one could trace that back to high fertility rates, lead to more dependency, less savings, therefore less investments.
Okay.
And what can be done to spur investment in the country? So you're looking at investment rate of around 15%, which is half of South Asia.
Right.
So it is not only that there's lack of savings rate, but also let's take the case of business regulations. Our preliminary analysis suggests that there are about, if you are a company in the service sector, you need to follow 1,500 requirements, regulations, licenses, permits,
Right.
administered by 40 entities.
Right.
And I don't think, people are going to have that kind of patience
Right.
to go through it.
So
So
what
how
are
do
the
you
low-hanging fruit that we can do something immediately about?
This is a low-hanging fruit.
The business procedures, for
Yeah,
example.
business procedures. We've been on ease of doing business. Pakistan has done well in the last one in 2019. Moved up from 147 to 136, but that's not what Pakistan given its potential, it should be less than 100 in a couple of years, and they need to continue pursuing it. And countries like, for example, Kenya, Turkey, Mexico, Korea, all of them employ the regulatory guillotine, and they slashed the number of these requirements by half, either through elimination or simplification. So I'm glad that the government has taken this forward. They've set up a mechanism now for Pakistan's regulatory guillotine.
Okay.
The first set of meetings happened very recently. So I'm hopeful with the kind of changes happening in the ease of doing business with this. Down the road in 2 years, I think that's a low-hanging fruit. A lot could be done.
Any other low-hanging fruits? Because this doesn't seem as if it's going to really achieve very much by itself.
No, but it would. Like, you have a large part of an undocumented economy.
Okay.
And one of the reasons people don't get your economy documented with the hassle factor.
Right.
So I think this is something that can happen.
Okay.
You know, when you're dealing with a lot of structural reforms, low-hanging fruits will have to be looking at, you know, in what I call in a space of how you sequence these strategies.
Okay.
But at the end of it, you can't win a few low-hanging fruits and then say, I'm done with and dusted and I'm now moving on with doing nothing about it. So in the case of human capital, when I said, you know, part of the reason is besides low investment capital, there is also Pakistan has a serious productivity gap. The total factor productivity is only around 1. It should be 2 or more.
Right.
And this is what Pakistan needs to invest in. So if you take the spending in health and education, it is around 3% of GDP, which is grossly inadequate for the size of Pakistan or
Right.
its development aspirations. Peer countries are double that amount. So what can they do to further boost spending?
Right.
For that, you have a very low tax collection.
Right.
That's the other big structural transformation. This is the third aspect of what we see in Pakistan at 100 is how do
Right.
you basically create more revenue space. And when you compare with other countries, after deducting for debt and defense, what you have is around 30% of your fiscal space.
Okay.
When compared, say, with Bangladesh, is 80%.
Wow.
That difference tells you why Bangladesh has invested much more in human capital. Another aspect of structural transformation is women's economic empowerment. You know, some don't think it's a low-hanging fruit. I think it's a low-hanging fruit. Why I say that is you still have a lot of women who are qualified who are not in the workforce. What can you do? For a variety of reasons, from socio-cultural to workplace safety to mobility from home to work and back.
Right.
All these are constraints. If you can create an environment in which more women can join the workforce, not the 25-26% you have
Right.
today,
Right.
if Pakistan can hope to, you know, sort of close that gap, what you're seeing is on an annualized basis, your growth rates can go up by, so if you're growing at 6% with closing the gap, you can be growing at 8%.
Right.
You know.
Okay. Very interesting.
So that's another one. Then coming to some of the more longer term issues, this would focus around the environment and climate change. We all know Pakistan
Right.
talks about a water crisis, which is true. Water availability per capita has been declining. But then if you look at is water availability the big issue or the water use the big issue? So the inefficiency in the water sector is huge.
Right.
Like say nearly 90% of your water use is in agriculture and irrigation, and you use it for 4 major crops. These 4 major crops, wheat, sugar, rice, and cotton, consume 80% of the water, but produce 5% of the GDP. And you have 30 plus other countries in the world which have less water per capita than Pakistan, which are much more efficient and bigger economies.
Okay.
And then the other 2 areas in Pakistan at 100 we are focused for our analysis is on the issue of equity. So yes, we've done well on poverty reduction, but then if you look at inequalities are growing between urban and rural areas, between say there are lagging regions, northern Sindh, southern Punjab,
Right.
parts of KP, Balochistan. So what can you do to equalize development? And here too is where the difference between men and women come into play as well. So how can you build in more equity in the way money is spent? And finally, and I think most critical, which has been the challenge in Pakistan as well as some of the other South Asian economies, I would say is governance,
Right.
quality of institutions, And here, transparency and accountability are vital. And of course, we've seen
So
some.
World Bank talks about elite capture.
Yeah.
What does it refer to as elite capture? And is Pakistan very different from the region in terms of elite capture?
I think elite capture is something you see across the region, but I think it's a fairly, I would say, a challenging one in Pakistan. If you look at various factors of the economy, like let me point out, you spend something like 0.8% of your budget on health, but you spend about double that amount on subsidizing about 185 plus state-owned enterprises.
Right.
So who benefits from loss-making state-owned enterprises?
Right.
Similarly, take the case of agriculture and water use. Since you don't have water pricing that is determined based on water use, or it's the way the formula works, if you are at the headwaters, you get more water, and if you're at the tail end, you don't get. Often what you see is the small poor farmers are the ones who end up not getting enough water.
Right, right.
So, and then it goes again, if you take Islamabad, the schooling system, you'll probably find top notch. But if you look at schools in Balochistan, I don't think you will
So
find.
how have other countries in the region addressed these issues? Similar issues must exist in India.
This exists in many countries. So what has happened is, one, you need to ensure that your policies and regulations that are put in place, it just doesn't end up benefiting only a few.
Right.
How do you have much more broad-based sort of benefits flowing from the policies and the legislation and regulations? Then the second is what I call the behavior shift that's needed, where the bureaucrats, the political leadership to the private sector all believe that, look, more people can benefit a country more than a few people. There is a big mindset change.
Right.
And here you can see to what extent the private sector is also large ones.
How do you create that mindset change? Because if I am benefiting from something, why would I ever want to give it up? How do you create a mindset change within the society?
So education plays a big part. Literacy plays a big part. Awareness plays a big part. So if you look at Pakistan's education outcomes, and it just tells you that why you have this issue of 25 million out of school youth.
Yeah.
And it largely comes from lack of opportunities.
So you have to create awareness for the majority so that it pushes for its rights, not that the minority will give away those rights automatically.
Yeah,
Okay.
and then disclosure becomes important. Like, for example, let's say who gets what subsidy, publish it.
Right.
Let's say which groups or which companies are the biggest gainers out of a beneficiary of a subsidy. Like, for example, in tax administration, they say, my colleagues tell me who have done analysis, 2% of taxes are lost because of all kinds of concessions and incentives that are given out. And that's a lot.
Right.
And in a country where it's struggling to get your tax to GDP up about 13%, if just imagine that 2% can be turned into more available resources for spending in health and education, it's going to benefit millions more.
So you mentioned that in the first 30 years, Pakistan was amongst one of the successful countries in the region. What went wrong then?
I think the focus probably shifted away from, what I would say the core developmental objectives. Its development is not static. Reforms need to continue to take place. And I think the policies of nationalization, which created these large, I would say, inefficient state-owned enterprises, started sort of sapping some of the resources. Geopolitical tensions, if you look at, Pakistan was caught up in the wars of the neighborhood. Obviously, that directed resources away.
Right.
Third is, I think, the overall quality of governance and quality of institutions started declining.
Deteriorating.
And I think the overall resolve to keep sustained economic reforms happening, I think the political will for that also began to diminish for a variety of reasons. And the private sector was not investing sufficiently enough. If you take in other countries, the big driver of job creation is the private sector.
Okay.
So they continued to invest. And here what you did see is either there was flight of capital going out or a lot more investments were happening in real estate, which to me is not very productive way of sort of expanding an economy.
Why did we see that shift into the real estate in Pakistan?
I think it's because the property taxes were very low and people felt you can invest in it, you don't have to pay much taxes.
Okay.
So if you look at the urban improvement property tax, I think the rates have been pretty much stagnant for years.
So the World Bank has been in Pakistan since 1952. What are some of the big achievements that the World Bank considers it's done in Pakistan during its time here?
I think in the early stages, the World Bank was involved in Mangla and Tarbela, the hydropower projects, which in a way became the backbone of energy security in the country, and which fueled and drove the economy in the early stages. So that's a big achievement, and we still are continuing to finance the expansion of Tarbela and now taking on other hydropower investments as well. The second, I would say, is the policy and the knowledge work that we've been doing over the years. Yes, there are two sides to the coin. Some say you were successful, some say we were successful, some say no, you gave us the wrong policies. This has been something that we often face in many countries. But the reality is, if you look over the last several years of decades, our support in technical assistance capacity building has helped the country as a whole. Third is, I would say, in the social sectors, health education, we continue to play a big part. And obviously the challenges are much bigger than what our financing alone can cope.
In terms of human skill development, where does Pakistan stand? What does it need to do? What are the interventions it needs to take to improve human skills in Pakistan?
So I always say human skills starts from from early childhood development. It is not like when you become adolescent and you're looking for a tertiary and vocational education.
Okay.
It starts with early childhood development. And why I say that? Because Pakistan has high stunting rates. And part of the best way to address stunting is, you start in the first 1,000 days of a child,
Right.
From conception. And the early childhood leads to then, a healthy baby, then, sort of the primary education. Focus on that, that's a second. Then would be a secondary. Then both your tertiary and your higher education system.
Okay.
So I think one has to look at that whole education system much more robustly and strategically than
broadly.
People think that, okay, it doesn't matter if you do early childhood, primary or secondary, but when you get to TVET, let's sort of really skill them up. They don't have the basic numeracy and literacy skills. Whatever you're going to provide when they're 14, when they're 17, 18, you're not going to be able to skill them up.
Right.
And the second, so first is this whole, take skills, but through an education life cycle. The second is around what I call the demand and supply in the skills side. And there is a mismatch. And today we don't see industry playing a big part. It can, in sort of ensuring that what are the TVETs doing in Pakistan that can be aligned better to the market needs of the kind of skills.
And how does the government get them involved then? Because they're obviously not doing it themselves.
So I think the Punjab Skills Fund is, what they're doing there is a good example. It's trying to build in consortium arrangements. So globally, there are lots of experiences of, private sector themselves setting up these vocational training schools in partnership, and whether they produce some, if you want to be a lathe machine operator or an electrician or a carpenter, all these skills are needed.
Right.
The third aspect of it is, while Pakistan sends a lot of its people for employment to the Middle East, and, that's a big earner for the, if you look at the remittances, but then when you compare, Pakistan doesn't jump from that lower end of these skills employment. Like if you compare, say, Filipinos and others are moving up that value chain. So I think Pakistan can really help towards breaking these people out of the lower end of the job chain.
But yet you've just suggested that there's no point focusing just on technical skills because you have to start from 5. So someone who's now 25, should I forget about him and just focus on his children instead?
No, I think you have to also give them the second chance program. And this is what we are advocating for the 23 or 25 million out-of-school youth in Pakistan. Give them a second chance program. For a variety of reasons, they could not go to school.
So put them back into school and teach them basic numeracy.
Teach them basic. And very recently when I was in Karachi, I met with this education startup, and where this very entrepreneurial Pakistani woman, she started this. Actually, how do you take digitized learning to these out-of-school youth and give them the basic education from literacy to numeracy, so that. And she was telling me that sometimes you see 14-year-olds who still are finding it very hard to count.
Of course, yeah.
And and the world as a whole has learning crisis, and the World Bank has come up with the Human Capital Index, and what it looks at is is a year of schooling equal to year of learning, and the answer is no. Sometimes you might be in school but you're not learning.
Right.
So how do you close the gap between learning and schooling?
Okay.
And that very much also is part of sort of skilling up your future workforce.
Okay. What's one project that you particularly like that you're doing in the World Bank that feels close to your heart?
I think there are a few. One is, I would say, the entire effort that we are taking across the country on nutrition to reduce stunting and improving early childhood development. It's a challenging area, but I think if we stay the course with the governments, that's the federal and provincial governments, I believe the gains are going to be dramatic, because that's at the heart of better human capital.
Right.
The second is the upcoming Karachi sort of infrastructure plus the housing we are doing. And to me, both Karachi obviously is 1/5 of Pakistan's economy.
Right.
And for Pakistan to become an upper middle income country, if Karachi can get its infrastructure to work, you're going to see that again sort of being the place where you're going to attract a lot of investments. Globally, we've seen how port cities have done very well.
Okay.
Housing is a fabulous area. And why I say that, in Pakistan, it takes about 20 years for a person to own a house, whereas internationally it's 5 years. But often I ask myself, what are the 2 or 3 areas that can actually take Pakistan out of what I would call its business as usual sector development? I think this is where I put tourism right on top. And my own travels in Pakistan suggest that you have everything what most countries offer as tourism attractions or assets or resources, whether it be the northern parts or whether it be the deserts or whether it be the heritage sites in Punjab and KPK. There's a lot that can offer and that Pakistan can offer. And I'm glad to see that with this new visa regime, I hope it will going to attract more tourists. The World Bank itself, we are having one project with Punjab. You were involved with it some time ago, and this is on sort of supporting Punjab government to boost its tourism prospects, including looking at heritage sites. And similarly, we are now doing one in KPK. Okay. And hopefully we will get that finalized in the coming months. Okay. So together there will be about $150 to $160 million for the 2 provinces.
What are you doing in those provinces? You're building?
So mainly it's like in Punjab, you have like the heritage sites, and if you look at them, they really don't have the right access roads. Okay. There is no opportunity for the communities living by it to have livelihoods. What can you do? Then our conversations with the government, we've also said you need to get on with a more sort of dynamic communications and marketing strategy, as you have seen what other countries have done. Okay. And then with the infrastructure sort of coming in place, then I'm sure Pakistan is by nature entrepreneurs, so their ability to attract international chains to come would immediately happen.
You've mentioned 2 major focus that you think are very important, which is the housing industry and then the tourism, which nicely are aligning with what the government's working on as well. Is there one more thing that you would ask the government to focus on, which would help to provide employment to the people?
Yeah, I think technology is another big one. And if you look at how other countries have successfully used technology to create a lot of jobs. Okay. And it's not only sort of jobs by having technology startups. Technology, whether it's tourism, whether it's housing, whether it's trade, whether it's agriculture, whether it's manufacturing, SMEs. Everywhere I think technology can play a big role.
Right.
And especially in the SME sector, if you start looking at how you can move towards digital payment systems,
Right.
you're going to see e-commerce flourishing in this country. And then job creation is going to happen. You know, you can have from micro entrepreneurs to mega entrepreneurs if you really have a seamless digital payment system in Pakistan.
Do you see that strategic focus of Pakistani governments on technology that you're referring is so important?
It is emerging, but a lot can be done on making technology and new economy a key part of what I would see Pakistan's future growth drivers.
Okay.
You know, so right now at the beginning I said the service sectors have to go through all this over regulatory burdens, and that also applies to all the tech companies.
Yep.
So how do you come up with a smart regulatory system for a digital future is what I think the focus should be going forward.